November 2019. For nearly 2 decades, The Ellen DeGeneres Show had mastered one thing better than almost anyone on television: making awkward moments look harmless. Every episode followed the same invisible pattern. Ellen would tease a guest. The guest would laugh. The audience would laugh. The moment would pass. It happened so often that no one questioned it anymore. Then Dakota Johnson walked onto the stage. At first, nothing felt unusual. The interview began like hundreds before it. Smiles, small talk, a few jokes. Then Ellen brought up Dakota's birthday party. She looked at Dakota and joked that she hadn't been invited. Normally, that joke would have ended the conversation. Guests usually laughed, apologized, or blamed a scheduling mistake. Dakota did none of that. She looked at Ellen and calmly replied, "That's not true. You were invited." The studio laughed. But the laughter didn't land the way it usually did. For the first time, the joke had nowhere to go. Instead of playing along, Dakota had corrected the story. Ellen smiled and quickly moved the interview forward. The conversation continued. The episode ended. Most people forgot about it. At the time, it looked like nothing more than a slightly awkward television moment. Nobody realized they had just watched a crack appear in one of the strongest public images in American entertainment. Because 8 months later, everything changed. In July 2020, former employees of The Ellen DeGeneres Show began describing a workplace that looked nothing like the one millions of viewers believed existed. Instead of warmth, they described fear. Instead of kindness, they described intimidation. Instead of openness, they described a culture where speaking honestly could cost someone their job. The allegations spread quickly. Former staff members shared similar experiences. News outlets began investigating. The public image Ellen had spent years building suddenly faced its biggest test. Then something unexpected happened. People didn't just read the allegations. They went back. Back to old interviews. Back to forgotten clips. Back to moments that had once seemed harmless. And one clip appeared everywhere. Dakota Johnson. One sentence. "That's not true. You were invited." The clip hadn't changed. The audience had. A moment that once looked mildly awkward now looked completely different. People weren't watching it to see what Dakota said. They were watching Ellen. Her reaction. Her expression. The way the conversation shifted after the correction. Millions of people started asking the same question. Had we been missing something all along? That question transformed a forgotten interview into one of the internet's most analyzed television moments. Because once people begin questioning a public image, they don't stop at one clip. They revisit everything. And that's exactly what happened. To understand why that interview exploded months later, you have to understand what Ellen actually represented. She wasn't just another talk show host. She was a symbol. Long before social media turned authenticity into a marketing strategy, Ellen had already built an entire career around one simple promise: be kind. That wasn't just a slogan. It became her identity. For millions of viewers, kindness and Ellen were almost the same thing. That trust didn't appear overnight. In 1997, Ellen publicly came out as gay at a time when doing so carried serious professional consequences. Her sitcom ended. Job opportunities disappeared. Television executives kept their distance. She paid a real price for being honest. When she eventually returned with a daytime talk show, audiences didn't just welcome her back. They rooted for her. They saw someone who had survived rejection and chosen optimism instead of bitterness. That story became the foundation of everything that followed. Every giveaway. Every emotional surprise. Every act of generosity. Every closing message asking people to be kind. The brand felt genuine because the story behind it felt genuine. For years, almost nobody questioned it. Then 2020 forced people to look again. As more former employees spoke publicly, a completely different picture began to emerge. Several described a workplace where fear traveled faster than communication. Others claimed favoritism determined opportunities. Some described discrimination. Others spoke about mental health struggles that received little understanding. Not every allegation was identical. But together, they pointed toward the same conclusion. The environment behind the cameras didn't match the one viewers saw on screen. Ellen responded. She apologized to her staff. She acknowledged that problems existed. She promised changes. But the public reaction was unusually cold. The problem wasn't only what she said. It was what people already believed. Once trust begins to break, every statement is measured against the past instead of the present. People weren't asking, "Is this apology sincere?" They were asking, "Have we misunderstood this person for years?" Those are two very different questions. One asks whether someone made mistakes. The other asks whether the entire image was built on something incomplete. That's a much harder question to answer. Because once doubt enters the conversation, old memories start changing. Viewers return to interviews they hadn't watched in years. Conversations that once seemed playful suddenly felt uncomfortable. Jokes people had ignored suddenly sounded different. Guests who looked slightly uneasy suddenly attracted attention. Nobody had discovered new footage. The footage had always existed. Only the perspective had changed. That's what makes public trust so fragile. Facts rarely change overnight. Interpretation does. The same clip can tell two completely different stories depending on what the audience already knows. That's exactly what happened to Ellen. Her image wasn't destroyed by a single article, or a single allegation, or even a single interview. It was damaged because millions of people started connecting moments they had never connected before. Each clip became another piece of a larger pattern. And once people believe they've found a pattern, every new example feels like confirmation. That's when rebuilding trust becomes almost impossible. Because facts can be challenged. Opinions can change. But once an audience feels deceived, logic rarely changes their mind. By the end of 2020, the conversation had moved far beyond workplace allegations. People were questioning the foundation of the entire brand. Not whether Ellen had made mistakes, but whether the version of Ellen they believed in had ever truly existed. That question would eventually become far more damaging than any single accusation. And it all led back to the same interview, the same guest, and the same sentence that refused to follow the script. By the time the final season aired, the damage had already been done. The show was still on television, but the trust that had built it was disappearing. Viewership declined. Advertisers became cautious. The conversation surrounding the show changed from celebration to scrutiny. After 19 years, the Ellen DeGeneres show came to an end in May 2022. Ellen said it was simply time to move on. Many believed the decision had become inevitable. Whatever the full story behind the ending, one fact was impossible to ignore. The brand had lost the one thing it depended on most: credibility. Looking back, it's tempting to believe Dakota Johnson exposed everything that followed. She didn't. She wasn't trying to start a controversy. She wasn't making a statement. She was correcting a simple fact. That's what makes the moment so fascinating. The sentence itself wasn't extraordinary. The timing was. If the workplace allegations had never surfaced, that interview would probably be forgotten today. But once people began questioning Ellen's public image, that moment became the clip everyone returned to. Not because it proved the allegations. Because it felt different after everything people had learned. That's how public perception works. A single event rarely changes history. History changes when old events gain new meaning. The Dakota interview became a symbol, not evidence. A symbol of something millions of viewers believed they had overlooked. And symbols are often more powerful than facts. Because facts explain. Symbols stay in memory. This is why celebrity scandals rarely end when the headlines disappear. People don't just judge the controversy. They replay years of interviews, speeches, photographs, and public appearances, searching for signs they missed the first time. Sometimes they find them. Sometimes they only think they do. Either way, the public narrative changes. Ellen's story isn't simply about one television host. It's about the enormous gap that can exist between a public image and private experiences. The bigger the image becomes, the more difficult it is to protect. Because reputations aren't built from facts alone. They're built from belief. And belief is surprisingly fragile. It can take decades to earn. A few months to question. And sometimes, only one unforgettable moment to lose. That doesn't mean every allegation against a public figure is automatically true. Nor does it mean every viral clip tells the whole story. Real life is rarely that simple. People are complicated. Workplaces are complicated. Power is complicated. But one thing remains true. When enough people begin doubting a carefully constructed image, every future appearance is judged differently. Every smile, every joke, every interview, everything is viewed through a new lens. That's exactly what happened here. Not because one sentence exposed a secret, but because one sentence made people stop accepting the story they had always been given. And once people start asking their own questions, no public relations campaign can answer them all. Maybe that's the real reason this interview is still discussed years later. Not because Dakota embarrassed Ellen. Not because the exchange was dramatic. But because millions of viewers recognized something deeply familiar. The quiet moment when someone calmly says, "That's not true." No shouting. No insults. No performance. Just a simple correction that interrupted a narrative everyone else had accepted. Those moments don't only happen on television. They happen in workplaces. In friendships. In families. Wherever one person controls the story, the truth often begins with someone willing to quietly disagree. That's why this clip survived. Not because it ended an empire. Because it reminded people how fragile every empire really is. Sometimes reputations collapse after years of scandal. Sometimes they collapse after one investigation. And sometimes, they begin collapsing the moment someone refuses to play the role everyone expected. That was never supposed to be the most memorable moment of the interview. Yet years later, it's the only moment almost everyone remembers.